Right now, in the narrow stretch of water separating Iran from Oman, a United States Navy carrier strike group is holding position, and American warships are stopping commercial tankers before they can even reach the open lanes of the Strait of Hormuz. This is not a drill. This is not old footage being recycled. As of this week, U.S. Central Command says its forces have redirected 49 commercial vessels, disabled 2, and boarded 2 more, all in the space of a few weeks, all in and around one of the most fought-over waterways on the planet. To understand why an American aircraft carrier is sitting off the coast of Oman right now, you have to go back 5 months. On February the 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike campaign against Iran. That opening wave was not just about military hardware. It included the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, a moment that reshaped the entire chain of command inside Tehran almost overnight. Iran's response was immediate, and it targeted the one thing the entire global economy depends on without ever thinking about it: the Strait of Hormuz. For anyone who has never had a reason to look closely at a map of the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz is the narrowest sea passage between Iran and Oman, roughly 21 miles across at its tightest point, with the actual shipping lanes themselves occupying only about 2 miles in each direction. Through that thin ribbon of water passes something close to 20 million barrels of oil every single day, according to figures compiled from Brookings and industry trackers, close to a fifth of everything the world consumes, along with roughly a fifth of the planet's liquefied natural gas. When Iran shut that passage down in response to the February strikes, according to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's own March 2nd announcement, it did not just hurt the United States. It threatened to choke off energy supplies to Japan, South Korea, China, and most of Western Europe in one move. None of this is actually new for the Strait of Hormuz, even if the scale of it is. Iran has claimed some form of authority over the strait since the 1979 revolution that brought the Islamic Republic to power, and it has repeatedly threatened to shut the passage down during moments of tension with Washington ever since, according to History.com's own timeline of the waterway. During the 1980s, in what came to be known as the Tanker War, an offshoot of the broader Iran-Iraq War, Iraq alone struck more than 280 vessels, and Iran struck roughly 168, according to figures from the U.S. Naval Institute, with both sides laying mines and firing on tankers up and down the Gulf. The United States responded then, much as it is responding now, launching Operation Earnest Will, reflagging Kuwaiti tankers as American vessels and personally escorting them through the strait. Even at its most intense, though, historians at the University of Texas's Strauss Center note that the tanker war never managed to disrupt more than about 2% of the ships actually passing through the Persian Gulf, a detail worth remembering anytime the phrase "closing the Strait of Hormuz" gets thrown around casually. The pattern of Iranian seizures continued long after the 1980s ended. In 2015, Iranian patrol boats seized a Danish-owned container ship, the Maersk Tigris, firing warning shots across its bow before boarding it. In July of 2019, the Revolutionary Guard seized a British-flagged tanker, the Stena Impero, describing it at the time as a response to the UK's own seizure of an Iranian tanker near Gibraltar, a move Britain's then Foreign Secretary called simply unacceptable. Iran seized another vessel, a Portuguese-flagged cargo ship, in 2024, and held 2 Greek tankers for months back in 2022. Through every one of those individual incidents, though, the strait itself stayed open. What makes the current crisis different, according to Al Jazeera's own comparison of the 2 eras published earlier this year, is that this is the first time since the 1980s that shipping through Hormuz has been disrupted on anything close to this scale, and the first time the United States Navy itself has been directly targeted by Iranian forces inside the strait, rather than simply escorting others through it. The United States did not wait long to respond to the February strikes with a much larger campaign than anything seen in prior decades. On March the 19th, the U.S. Air Force and Navy, alongside the Israeli Air Force, began an aerial campaign specifically aimed at reopening the strait. American aircraft used 5,000-pound GBU, 72 bunker-buster munitions against underground missile silos along the Iranian coastline, the same silos that had been storing the cruise missiles and anti-ship missiles Iran was using to threaten tankers passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Israel, for its part, is reported to have assassinated Alireza Tangsiri, the Iranian naval officer who had been personally overseeing the blockade operations, along with several of his aides. The economic shock that followed was almost immediate. By the end of March, Brent crude had jumped by roughly 65%, according to World Bank commodity market tracking, its steepest monthly rise on record, with physical cargoes at one point trading close to $150 a barrel. The International Energy Agency reportedly described it as the largest single supply disruption in the history of the oil market. Shipping insurers pulled back almost overnight. War risk premiums that had been sitting around a fifth of 1% of a vessel's hull value jumped toward 2.5% to 5% within days, according to insurance industry trackers. meaning it could suddenly cost a single supertanker close to $5 million just to ensure one transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Major container lines, including Maersk and CMA CGM, suspended their Gulf routes altogether, rerouting ships around the Cape of Good Hope instead, adding close to 4,000 nautical miles and up to 2 weeks to every voyage. Analysts at the Dallas Federal Reserve later estimated that if the disruption stretched across 3 full quarters, it could shave more than a full percentage point off global economic growth. It is worth being precise about exactly who gets hurt when the Strait of Hormuz seizes up, because the popular image of an oil crisis hitting American drivers first is not really accurate here. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration's own analysis of tanker tracking data, roughly 84% of the crude oil and 83% of the liquefied natural gas that normally moves through the Strait of Hormuz is bound for Asian markets, not for the United States or Europe. China alone receives close to 38% of everything that flows through the strait, according to the same EIA figures, making it by a wide margin the single largest customer for Hormuz oil on Earth. India takes in nearly 15%, South Korea around 12%, and Japan close to 11%. The United States, by contrast, receives only about 2.5% of Hormuz flows, a reflection of just how much American domestic oil production has grown in recent years. Research from Zero Carbon Analytics adds an important wrinkle to those raw numbers. Japan sources close to 87% of its total energy from imported fossil fuels, and South Korea around 81%, giving both countries almost no cushion if the strait stays disrupted, whereas China, despite importing the largest absolute volume, is significantly more insulated because it can lean on pipeline oil from Russia and Central Asia, along with its own substantial domestic production. That is part of why, even as Washington and Tehran trade blows over the Strait of Hormuz, the loudest economic alarm bells have consistently come out of Tokyo and Seoul rather than out of Beijing. By April the 13th, the United States had escalated again, this time imposing a full naval blockade on Iran's own ports, an operation that ran from April through mid-June. The goal was straightforward on paper: stop any vessel from entering or leaving Iranian ports until Tehran backed down. In practice, it turned the Strait of Hormuz into one of the most heavily patrolled and heavily contested bodies of water in the world, with American destroyers, an aircraft carrier, and fighter jets running constant patrols over a passage barely wide enough for 2 supertankers to pass each other safely. Governments outside the region moved quickly to cushion the shock. On March the 11th, the International Energy Agency approved what it called the largest coordinated release of emergency oil reserves in its history, agreeing to release 400 million barrels among its 32 member countries. The United States alone committed to releasing 172 million barrels from its own strategic petroleum reserve, according to the Department of Energy, with officials saying the release would take about 120 days to fully deliver. None of it stopped the pain at the pump. Brent crude broke above $100 a barrel and briefly traded near $120. Gas prices in parts of the United States climbed past $5 a gallon, according to reporting from that period. A spokesperson for Iran's Revolutionary Guard told Reuters at the time that Americans should, in his words, get ready for oil at $200 a barrel, tying the price directly to what he called the regional security that Washington and Israel had destabilized. The blockade has not been painless for Iran either. A White House official told CNBC in late April that the naval blockade was costing Tehran roughly $500 million a day, and tanker tracking firm Kepler found that Iran's oil and condensate loadings collapsed from about 2.1 million barrels a day before the blockade to just 567,000 barrels a day afterward. The Pentagon separately estimated Iran had lost close to $4.8 billion in oil revenue by the start of May. Energy analysts at Rapidan Energy cautioned at the time that Iran had clearly prepared for this kind of squeeze in advance, filling storage tanks rather than immediately cutting production, meaning the economic pressure was real but slow-moving rather than an instant knockout blow. The scale of the human toll trapped inside that patrol zone is easy to lose in the military numbers. According to the head of the International Maritime Organization, speaking at a summit in mid-April, roughly 20,000 seafarers and close to 2,000 vessels were, at one point, effectively stranded inside the Persian Gulf, unable to move because insurance had evaporated and crews were unwilling to risk the passage. The IMO chief told that summit plainly that straits used for international navigation cannot legally be closed by the countries bordering them, and that no nation has the legal right to impose tolls or discriminatory conditions on a strait like Hormuz, a principle that has technically applied to this waterway since a traffic separation scheme was first set up jointly by Oman and Iran back in 1968. That legal argument did not stay theoretical for long. On April the 17th, France and the United Kingdom convened 51 countries for an international summit specifically focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz, with both governments pledging to draw on collective diplomatic, economic, and military tools to restore free passage. By May the 12th, Defense ministers from 38 nations had signed onto political support for what was being called the multinational military mission, a strictly defensive coalition tasked with mine clearance and reassurance patrols rather than combat operations. France committed naval assets built around its own aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, while Britain offered the Royal Fleet auxiliary ship Lyme Bay as a mine hunting platform, working with drones, divers, and helicopters to clear Iranian sea mines from the strait. That coalition, though, has not moved as fast as Washington wanted. According to Al Jazeera's reporting this past week, the United States has spent months trying to build a genuine international naval escort force for the Strait of Hormuz, but European partners, including Britain and France, have been visibly reluctant to fully commit, insisting on a durable ceasefire first. Part of that reluctance, according to Politico's reporting cited by multiple outlets, stems from European frustration that Washington did not warn its allies before launching the initial February strikes on Iran. A British minister was quoted distinguishing clearly between combat operations, which the UK has stayed out of, and the Freedom of Navigation mission, which London says it fully supports in principle. There was a brief window in the middle of all this where it looked like the fighting might actually end for good. On June the 17th, the United States and Iran reached a ceasefire, brokered through a memorandum of understanding that laid out terms for reopening the Strait of Hormuz to oil shipping. U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance met with Iranian officials in Switzerland around that time, and for a few weeks, tankers genuinely began moving again. Oil prices eased, and by early July, UK and French officials were confirming that Oman had agreed to let the two countries help secure its territorial waters as shipping picked back up. But that calm did not last. Internal opposition on both sides, hardliners in Tehran who saw the deal as surrender and hawks in Washington who felt Iran had not been punished enough, pulled the agreement apart within weeks. On July the 7th, Iran fired on 3 commercial vessels inside Oman's own territorial waters near the strait, according to a U.S. official cited by CNN. Central Command responded within hours, launching what it called punishment strikes against Iranian targets. What followed was some of the sharpest escalation of the entire war. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps claimed it had launched attacks on 85 U.S. military targets across Bahrain and Kuwait. That figure has not been independently verified by any Western wire service, and it should be treated as an Iranian state claim rather than a confirmed fact. What is confirmed through Central Command's own statements is that the United States hit approximately 90 military-related sites inside Iran in the days that followed, and that Tehran said an American strike had hit a railway bridge in the country's north. At the NATO summit in Turkey, President Trump described the Iranian leadership as, in his words, evil, sick people, and declared the Memorandum of Understanding over. More U.S. strikes followed within hours of that statement. Sirens were reported activated across Bahrain and Kuwait as the renewed bombing campaign resumed. On July the 14th, President Trump ordered the naval blockade against Iran reimposed, and it is that blockade, still running today, that explains exactly what the U.S. military is doing in the Strait of Hormuz right now. Central Command has been posting near daily updates on the number of vessels intercepted. 9 days into the renewed blockade, the count stood at just 12 commercial vessels redirected and 1 disabled. On August the 2nd, the figure had climbed to 35 commercial vessels redirected, 2 disabled, 2 boarded. By August the 3rd, it had climbed to 44. By August the 5th, 48. And by August the 6th, Central Command put the number at 49 vessels redirected, 2 boarded, and 2 disabled. An operation, it says, is designed purely to stop traffic entering or leaving Iranian ports and coastal areas, not to close the strait to everyone else. That last distinction matters because Iran disputes it entirely. According to Central Command, confirmed by multiple outlets including Middle East Eye and Just the News, a Marine Corps F-35C stealth fighter has been launching regularly from the USS Abraham Lincoln as the carrier transits the Arabian Sea in direct support of the blockade. The Lincoln did not arrive alone. According to Navy tracking compiled by USNI News, the carrier's strike group includes the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers USS Spruance, USS Michael Murphy, and USS Frankie Peterson Jr., operating as escorts under what the Navy has designated Operation Epic Fury. At the height of the blockade's buildup in April, reporting from the National counted as many as 3 separate U.S. carrier strike groups built around the Abraham Lincoln, the George H.W. Bush, and the Gerald R. Ford, backed by roughly 10 destroyers in total, with Bahrain hosting the 5th Fleet's littoral combat ships and their mine countermeasure teams. That is the kind of concentrated American naval power that has not been assembled in the Persian Gulf in years, and it is still, in large part, sitting there right now. Meanwhile, Iran has designated its own narrow coastal corridor as what it calls the only safe route through the Strait of Hormuz, forcing vessels to choose between 3 competing paths: an Iranian-controlled route, a route proposed by Oman and the International Maritime Organization that hugs the Omani coastline, and whatever narrow lanes the Navy is currently allowing. Even now, traffic through the strait has not returned to anything close to normal. Data compiled from the IMF's own Portwatch tracking system, current as of late July, showed roughly 10 vessels transiting the strait on an average day, against a pre-crisis baseline that used to run somewhere between 88 and 130 vessels daily. Some of that gap may be slightly overstated, since a number of tankers have reportedly been switching off their tracking transponders while moving under naval escort. But even accounting for that, the Strait of Hormuz remains by any measure a fraction as busy as it was before February. The human and commercial cost of this standoff is not abstract. The Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, one of the largest energy producers on Earth, said this past Friday that 15 of its own vessels have been struck in what it called unprovoked attacks while transiting the Strait of Hormuz since the war began. According to the company, those attacks killed one crew member and wounded 20 others. Zoom out further, and open source tracking places the wider toll at 17 merchant ships damaged since the crisis began in February, of which 7 were abandoned by their crews, 2 merchant ships captured outright, 12 seafarers killed or missing, and 1 port worker killed with 2 more wounded in an attack in Bahrain. A single tugboat has been sunk. These are not soldiers. These are merchant sailors who had no stake in a war between Washington and Tehran, caught in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz simply because their job was to move cargo through it. Charter rates for supertankers willing to make the run reportedly jumped from around $37,000 a day before the crisis to as high as $177,000 a day at the peak. A cost that, industry analysts note, eventually works its way into everyday fuel and retail prices far beyond the Gulf. Back home in the United States, the political fallout from all of this reached Congress directly. In a letter sent to the Trump administration in March, one member of the House of Representatives pointed out that a third of the world's fertilizer supply also transits the Strait of Hormuz, warning that American farmers preparing for spring planting were facing delayed shipments on top of already high production costs, and pressed the administration to coordinate a strategic reserve release the way the Biden administration had after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. That comparison undersells the scale of what happened in 2026. The 60 million barrel release coordinated after the Ukraine invasion was, by the IEA's own accounting, dwarfed by the 400 million barrel release triggered by the Strait of Hormuz crisis, underlining just how much more disruptive a closure of this particular choke point is considered to be compared to almost anything else that can happen to the global oil market. Iran's rhetoric has not softened. Mohsen Rezai, a military advisor to Iran's supreme leader Mojtaba Khamenei, who succeeded his father after the February assassination, told Iranian state television this week that Iran's armed forces will not, in his words, stand idly by while the naval blockade continues. Rezai went further, warning that if the United States brings warships into what Iran considers the illegal alternate routes through the Strait of Hormuz, Iran will target them directly. He also accused Washington of violating the June Memorandum of Understanding by striking Iran without first referring the dispute to an agreed resolution committee. None of that language has been independently verified beyond the fact that Rezai said it on Iranian state media, and viewers should treat it as a stated Iranian position, not a confirmed operational plan. At the same time, there are real signs that both sides may be looking for an exit. On August the 7th, a U.S. official told Reuters that Washington expects a deal soon between Iran and Oman, specifically over control of the strait, a deal the official described as crucial to any broader peace agreement. That same official said that once a deal to restore unimpeded commercial shipping is announced, the United States will lift its blockade of Iranian ports. President Trump, speaking earlier in the month, said he was giving Iran, in his words, every last chance before what he called decapitation, while also insisting he was not working against any fixed deadline and wanted to give the Iranian people, as he put it, a chance to let a lot of people live. He claimed that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and even Iran itself had personally asked him to hold off on further strikes just before a planned operation. Adding another layer to this story, Central Command's own reporting has not shown any new strikes on Iran since July the 29th, according to reporting compiled this week, suggesting a de facto pause even without a formal announcement. Analysts have also pointed to visible cracks inside Iran's own leadership, with signs of tension between Iran's civilian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, and the country's other centers of power, namely the Revolutionary Guard and Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei. In a state television interview broadcast this past Friday, Pezeshkian defended his government's engagement with negotiations against hardliners who accuse him of being too willing to talk to Washington. The regional response to all of this has been just as dramatic as anything happening on the water. On Friday, August the 7th, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Pakistan signed a joint defense agreement in the holy city of Mecca. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman hosted Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif for the signing. The agreement, formerly called the Mecca Joint Defense Agreement, states plainly that an armed attack on any one of the three nations will be treated as an attack on all three, according to reporting from Al Monitor and Iran International. A Turkish official described the pact as purely defensive and aimed at no specific country. Iran was not fooled and did not wait to be named. Within hours, Iranian officials and clerics were mocking the agreement on state media, with one warning that what he called the roar of Iranian missiles would reach the signatories directly. The backdrop to that pact is worth sitting with for a moment. Since the war began on February the 28th, Iran and groups aligned with it have struck U.S. bases and civilian infrastructure across Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Oman, and Jordan. On the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, Iran's Yemen-based allies, the Houthis, have opened a parallel front, targeting shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, and declaring what amounts to a naval embargo against Saudi ports there. Carrier operators tracking that route have reported it running at less than half its pre-crisis shipping capacity for extended stretches this year. For Gulf monarchies, who built their entire security posture around an American umbrella, 3 years of regional war have apparently raised a harder question about how far that umbrella still extends, and the Mecca Pact looks very much like an answer, or at least an attempt at one. So, where does that leave the Strait of Hormuz today? On the water, right now, the picture is this. A U.S. carrier strike group, built around the USS Abraham Lincoln, continues to patrol the Arabian Sea approaches to the strait, launching F-35 Sea fighters in support of an active naval blockade against Iranian ports. Central Command is intercepting on average several commercial vessels a day, a number that has climbed steadily from 35 to 49 in under a week. Iran continues to insist on its own narrow, self-designated shipping corridor, and continues to warn that any American warship entering the alternate routes will be treated as a target. A separate, Western-led coalition built around Britain and France still exists on paper, with political backing from dozens of nations, but has yet to deploy in full, still waiting, by its own stated terms, for a ceasefire durable enough to make deployment safe. Diplomats in Washington say a deal between Iran and Oman to fully reopen the strait could come soon, and that the blockade would be lifted the moment that happens. Nobody involved, publicly, is putting a date on when soon actually means. Before we go further, a quick and honest note on sourcing. The vessel interception figures throughout this video come directly from U.S. Central Command's own public statements, cross-confirmed by Reuters, Just the News, and Middle East Eye. The casualty and vessel damage figures for the wider conflict come from open aggregated tracking alongside the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company's own Friday statement. The oil price, insurance, and shipping cost figures are drawn from World Bank commodity market reporting, the Dallas Federal Reserve, Brookings, and industry trackers monitoring war risk premiums and charter rates. The coalition and diplomatic material comes from official statements by the UK, France, and the IMO, as well as Al Jazeera's reporting on the coalition's current hesitation. The diplomatic reporting on the Oman-Iran talks and the expected deal comes from Reuters, relayed through a U.S. official quoted anonymously, which means it should be treated as credible but not yet finalized until an actual agreement is announced. Iran's claim of 85 strikes on U.S. targets in Bahrain and Kuwait comes solely from Iranian state television and the Revolutionary Guard's own statements, and has not been independently verified, so we are flagging it here as contested rather than confirmed. Everything involving the Mecca Defense Pact is drawn from the country's own joint statement as reported by Al Monitor, Iran International, and Reuters. There is a version of this story that ends quietly, with a shipping deal between Tehran and Muscat, a lifted blockade, and tankers moving through the Strait of Hormuz again without a U.S. warship escorting them. There's another version where Rezai's warning turns out to be exactly what he said it was, and the next headline out of the strait is not about redirected vessels, but about a direct hit on a U.S. Navy ship. Both versions are being written at the same time, this week, in the same stretch of water. What do you think happens first? A real deal on the Strait of Hormuz, or another round of strikes? Let us know where you think this goes next. Thanks for watching, and we will keep tracking this one as it develops.